Okay, thank you, Jan, for the introduction. So today I will talk about magnetic helicoidal dichroism. I was very happy to have, for once, a short title. Usually we tend to write rather long titles. But then yesterday night at dinner, kind of realized that I was pointed out that I shouldn't call this helicoidal dichroism because if you take just a beam secretly polarized, this already has an helix shape, so it's kind of ambiguous. So it would be better to call it magnetic vortex dichroism. Then I was pointed out also that dichroism historically was introduced as a property of absorption of a photon, and we deal with scattering of light rather than absorption. So this should be maybe called magnetic vortex differential scattering. At least it's magnetic. But then, since we will work, as I will present, especially on a sample which is a magnetic vortex, this also is ambiguous, so maybe it should be magnetic vortex differential scattering, so I hope we agree that we still keep calling, at least for the presentation, magnetic helicoidal dichroism. So this is the outline of my talk. I will not go through an introduction, as I usually would do, to present orbital angular momentum of light and everything. Here is definitely not necessary, so we'll go directly to the main question, which is how to describe this phenomenon. First, we did an analytical description of this process, and then I will present two experiments. The first one, a static one, as a proof of principle, and then what we managed to do afterwards, a pump and probe, time-resolved magnetic helicoidal dichroism experiment on a magnetic vortex as a target example. So the main question in my group that we were trying to answer in general is what happens when you study light-matter interaction with the case of orbital angular momentum, which is a very general question, basically the main question of this workshop in particular. So a bit more specifically, we decided to start to tackle this question in the case of magnetism because magnetism is a rich, it presents many types of phenomena that can change the light properties when they interact, right? The intensity, polarization, phase, etc. in different experiments like Moog, Faraday effect, Zeeman, etc. So just in general, if we switch the spin angular momentum of the light, we have dichroic effects. What happens if now we start to play also with the orbital angular momentum when light interacts with magnetic targets? And in particular, we concentrate on the case of, as I said, scattering from a target. So this is a result that we started to work with in the group of Thierry Rouchon in CEA, and in particular working with some people that are here. Maurice, who introduced already yesterday this topic, and Martin Lutman, who will present tomorrow another related talk. So the situation is the following. We have this is a setup similar to Moog, magneto-optical carrier effect, where we have light coming in on a sample, and then it's scattered away, and you measure in the far field the intensity profile. Then, depending on what you measure, you call this different type of technique. But so this is just for now the theory. And so we plug in the analytical expression of the electric field of light being carrying orbital angular momentum. And then, in order to take into account all possible types of magnetic structure, we try to study not a specific target, but some in general case. So we simply analyze by Fourier analysis the symmetry of the topology of the structure. So this will take into account all possible inhomogeneous magnetic structures, such as, for instance, antiferromagnetic domains, magnetic vortex, schemions, so whatever you can think of that you can just then analyze by Fourier, especially on the azimuthal component of this structure. And so n, in this case, the index n is what runs on this Fourier decomposition. The case of a magnetic vortex is a particular one because it's very simple. In this case, you only have this n index equal to 1 and minus 1. All the others are 0, obviously. And then we treat the interaction in the simplest case possible, which is just writing the reflectivity matrix, which depends on the actual properties of the particular material taken into account, the geometry, the photon energy, and so on. But these are coefficients that you put in the matrix. And then you can calculate the electric field out as the product of the reflectivity matrix times the electric field in, very simple. And then you can propagate these to the far field and measure the intensity profile on the detector. So it's very standard, but still is not so trivial to go through everything in all the details. And the take-home message of all of this study is the following, which is quite interesting. If you come in with an orbital angular momentum of the light of value L, you come out with all the possible L plus N. So if you come, for example, with 1, you go out from a vortex with 1, 0, and 2. So you change the population of modes, of orbital momentum modes, of the scattered light when it interacts with the magnetic target. And therefore, if you now measure the intensity profile in the far field of the scattered beam, this beam will carry information on the topology of the magnetic material. Therefore, now you can start to take differences when you change some parameter in this experiment, and you end up with the types of dichroism, which we call like this: magnetic helicoidal dichroism L, when we switch the value of L, of the orbital angular momentum of the light, or M, when you switch the sign of the magnetization, because this also can be done, of course. And it turns out that in this case, it gives two different quantities. These two quantities are analytically not the same, as it is, for example, in magnetic circular dichroism, at least in the Doppler approximation. Changing a magnetic field or changing circular polarization like that is the same. This is not the case, and therefore there exists also a third one where we switch both, and the three of them are nicely related, as you could even understand rather straightforward. So all of this is quite is trivial, but it's really not easy. And I'm an experimentalist, so the only way to do this, actually, I have to acknowledge COVID confinement, because we couldn't go to the lab for quite a while. So we sit down and start to write all these formulas. But the nice thing now is that we can put this into a code and numerically calculate the beam profile that we expect when we want to do an experiment of this magnetic vortex-vortex differential scattering experiment. Okay. Now, actually, I want to come back to this naming thing, because it's true that dichroism in principle is for absorption, and we are doing scattering, but at least for a bulky sample, the two are quite closely related, right? Because if there's no transmission, absorption and reflection is just simple relationship. So the two effects are related. And then we tend to use dichroism also with abuse of language in different types of experiment, photoemission, resonant inelastic scattering, etc. And second, if I'm not wrong, I think that there's a difference between helical and helicoidal, because helical means with respect to an helix, which is a line. So the circular polarization would be the helical property of light, and helicoidal refers to a helicoid, which is a helical surface, which is the wavefront. So I think did we know this when we wrote it? Definitely not. But where we write, probably yes. So I think I will keep calling this magnetic helicoidal dichroism. But thanks for pointing this out, because it's interesting. So a bit more seriously, so now this is the experiment that we did at Fermi FEL in Trieste, at the Dichroism beamline. So you have seen this image already a couple of times. So maybe I explain a bit more of the details now. This is the spiraling zone plate that we have seen already in many presentations, that imparts OAM to the beam from the FEL, and it focuses onto the sample, which is here. And then the light is scattered and collected on a CCD in the far field at a given angle, close to the Brewster angle in this case. The sample, you can apply a magnetic field with a solenoid, very simple. And we chose to start to study with the magnetic vortex, as I said, because it's a simple case for our analytical derivation. And Maurizio calculated through micromagnetic simulation a particular shape of a target that we have to have in order to have something very nicely close to a vortex of the same size of the beam. So our beam was about 5 micron large, lateral size, and in this permalloy dot, which is 15 microns diameter, in the center, you form a very nice magnetic vortex, which has a direction which is well defined by the shape of this cut, like this mouth of the Pac-Man. Because if you now apply a magnetic field, for example, this is really not so obvious to point. Yeah, if you apply a magnetic field in the direction of this mouth, you impose the magnetization to follow this direction to the right, for example, and then from micromagnetic simulation, you prove that you will always have a vortex that turns to the left or to the right if you have a sample upside down. And then if you switch the applied magnetic field, you switch the magnetic vortex in both cases. So this is something that is reproducible in our experiment, which is easier than switching the orbital argument on light, because this, of course, is nice. It's easy to do it in theory, but in practice, everyone who does experiment with zone plates knows very well that this is extremely complex to make sure that everything is exactly the same when you repeat now with different OEM, because you need to align the zone plates exactly in the same way, and practically is really, in my opinion, really almost impossible, right? So we decide to keep a given OEM and then switch the magnetization. So we measure this MHD-M type of dichroism, and then study this as a function of different values of OEM, at least. At least we can rely a bit better our data. So basically now I take the differences of two different vortices. I actually a bit more pragmatically just the difference of applied magnetic fields to the right or to the left, which means that for two samples of opposite symmetries, I expect to have opposite colors in our dichroic images. This is the result that we find from the numerical simulations of the model that I introduced before, where we have for different values of the incoming beam with OAM equal -1, 0, or 1 for the two samples. And this was the result of our experiment. We are very happy to see that when you take care of all the details of the experiment, it turns out that you can nicely reproduce, at least qualitatively, all the symmetries that you expect from the theory. In particular, for the OAM of 1 and -1, we have this type of yin-yang shape, red and blue, that changes sign accordingly to what you expect with theory. And then with L equals 0, you have this vertical separation between left and right. OK, so I want to point out that this is, in principle, simple, but in practice, very difficult to experiment, right? Because this is the actual image. So this image here, for example, is taken as the difference of these two. As you can see, this is extremely far from a nice beam profile that you would expect, right? This is definitely just a lot of non-magnetic scattering from impurities or from the surface of the sample, etc. So only when you take differences of these, you can actually remove the non-magnetic contribution. And it turns out that you can really highlight this contribution for the magnetic scattering. But still, you have to make sure that, once again, also here, everything is well aligned, that you are exactly in the center of the vortex, etc. If you do this carefully, you find that, indeed, we can reproduce. And this has been done in two different beam times. Very happy to figure this out. It was not just one shot. We find all these nice symmetries that switch as you would expect. Now, to understand the shapes of these images and where does this MHD comes from, I think the numerical simulation helped quite a lot to visualize, because at the end it's quite simple. These are the beam profile that you would expect, calculated beam profile in the far field for the four cases, for example, of M is the index of the vortex, or to the right or to the left, and L is the orbital momentum. As you can see, that you have four different shapes. That's why if you take differences, MHD, M, or L, you get different images, right? And then it turns out that if you now numerically suppress, virtually suppress the outgoing, from the outgoing beam, the one that was put in, L out equal L in, if you remove that, the image is symmetric. You see it like that, like here. Oops. And therefore, at the end, what gives this kind of yin-yang shape, this spiraling shape in the far field profile, is the interference between the incoming mode, L in, and the newly produced +1 and -1 for the vortex. So the interference between these two give rise to the dichroic signal. OK, so it's not an easy experiment, but reproducible. And it is sensitive to the overall magnetic topology within the probed beam. While usually you average out what you see under the beam, in this case, we are sensitive somehow to the overall topology within the beam, which is nice. So now we want to exploit the fact that we are at FEL, because this was just a static experiment, just a very expensive laser. Now we can, or very expensive light source, like a synchrotron, but we now can use the time structure of the FEL to study this as a function of time. And this is now the result of this large collaboration, which let me acknowledge everyone here in this slide. Again, collaborators from CEA, from Fermi FEL, Maurizio from Sorbonne and Pietro, and Benedict Rosner and Christian David, who provide to everyone, apparently, zone plates, right? So the experiment is exactly the same, but now we add a pump, infrared pump, with the femtosecond time duration, which therefore, on a magnetic sample, it is very well known that this will demagnetize the sample, and then it will remagnetize as a function of time. This is well known, but the microscopic origin of this is still a huge question in magnetism under discussion since a couple of decades at least. So instead of just one static measurement, now we have a sequence of MHD-M images as a function of time delay between the pump and the probe. And we find two main observations. So one is that, first of all, the intensity of the signal drops down at time 0 and then recovers in a similar fashion as it does magnetic signal in ultra-fast pump and probe, right? So this is the extremely well-known image from ultra-fast magnetism where the magnetization goes down and then recovers, and we follow something of the same shape, which is nice, but kind of you could expect. And a bit more surprisingly, we find out that if you now highlight the contrast of these images, the shape of the MHD imaging are changing, right? In particular, the white line that separates the two blue and red parts seems to rotate as a function of time, and then it comes back to the static case after some given time. So let's study this a bit more in detail. And it turns out that if you now plot the rotation angle of this image as a function of time, it follows precisely the dichroic signal, the intensity signal, which means that really this variation of the MHD image is a signature of a qualitative change of the magnetic structure. Not only the magnetization is going down in terms of intensity, but also somehow the structure is modified, and this is quite difficult to probe in magnetism, right, within this time scale. So for example, this was another data set for a given value of OAM, etc. Of course, we study for different combinations of these, and we find, for example, this data. Then, for completeness, we study, for example, when it turns out that nicely, if you switch the value of the OAM, you switch the direction to where the rotation angle of the MHD image rotates. And in particular, if you now increase the fluence of the pump laser, you reach a given point where the rotation angle saturates at 180 degrees, meaning that the whole MHD image basically is reversed during the magnetization time, and then it recovers back. So this is quite curious because it means somehow that the structure has changed direction. So let's study this a bit more in detail. For this, we asked the colleagues in Grenoble from CEA SpinTech to make a micromagnetic model of this type of sample. So we take into account the geometry of the sample, or the details, etc., and we do the following model. Now here, there's nothing about interaction with light. The only thing we do here is to say, let's take our magnetic dot, and we write that at time 0, the magnetization is not the static one, but it is in the case of being completely demagnetized at the surface because there has been thermal energy deposited by the infrared pulse. And then, as long as the local temperature is above Curie temperature, it keeps staying completely demagnetized. But then at some point, when the temperature is higher than room temperature but below the Curie temperature, then it is in a not completely demagnetized, not completely magnetized state, something in between with an exponential decay. So we take this, which is a out of equilibrium situation for this magnetic object, and then we let evolve as a function of time. And then we take for each point in time and for each layer of this sample, the magnetic structure, and plug this into the numerical simulation of MHD images in order to study what we expect to measure. And this is the results, therefore, of this model study. So in here, it's plotted the Y component of the magnetization in pink and green scale, and then also the vortex for each layer and as a function of time for selected points. And as you can see, of course, the time 0, as I said, is completely demagnetized at the surface and less towards the bottom, towards the bulk, and then this recovers as a function of time. And then we take each of these images, as I said, as a input for our simulations of MHD, and then coherently sum all the results, taking into account the penetration depth of the infrared and of the FEL XUV. And this is the result of the numerical simulations in B, and in A, it is our experimental results. So again, small details are far from being matching, right? Because this is extremely complex to really describe precisely in detail. But we were very happy to find out once again that overall, qualitatively, it still makes sense. At time 0, you have this blue-red yin and yang that recovers after some 40 picoseconds. And in between, something happens, especially when at very short time delays, the signal is extremely low. Therefore, this is quite difficult. It's just noise. It's difficult to say what's happening. But in particular, there are some regions where, surprisingly, the signal here is reversed. It's red and blue. And it is also what we measure, red and blue, rather than blue-red. So somehow, a cartoonish picture of what's happening here to the left is that at first you have the magnetic vortex within the whole bulk. And then as a function of time, first you demagnetize less and less towards the bulk. But then somehow this out of equilibrium situation propagates kind of a solid tonic image. This propagates the remagnetization pulse, propagates towards the surface, and competes with the bulk, which is still fully magnetized in one direction, and somehow, for a transient time at the surface, for no particular fundamental reason, in this geometry, it happens that the magnetic vortex transiently switches sign, which we can measure in our experiment and reproduce with the simulation. So this was very nice. Let's now maybe also quantify this a bit better. And for this, we use the quantity called toroidal moment. So if you are not familiar with this, just very briefly, electrical dipole moment, we all know it's just two charges separated in space. Then you have the magnetic dipole moment, where you have now the charge that is moving in a current loop, and the magnetic dipole moment is the one that goes through this loop. If now you have a second order of this idea, then you now have a magnetization that goes in a loop, then you have the toroidal moment that goes through this loop. This is quantity in general, it's called toroidal moment. And instead of calculating this for the vortex, which is quite boring to do it precisely, then still you can calculate a parameter that we introduce, which is proportional to the toroidal moment, which is simply the line integral of the magnetization around a given radius of the magnetization. So we just sum. So if the vortex is fully a vortex, then this would be 1 or minus 1, 0 if it's completely random, and something in between when the structure is something in between a random situation and a vortex. And now this is what we find for the simulations. We don't see much here, but at least we see that, so this is the remagnetization towards the surface, and the color scale is asymmetric to highlight that there is one pixel in this image where the signal changes sign. And if now I treat a bit this image, take just the second derivative of the image, you realize that this is quite interesting to figure out that indeed when the second derivative, just to highlight the sharpness of this image, right? So in this case, when the remagnetization pulse reaches the surface, kind of bounces at the surface and keep propagating towards the bottom, back, down, which of course we can't probe, but they are happening, and the speed of this propagation is of the order of the phonon velocity of the magnon velocity, which somehow makes sense. So I maybe was on time, maybe even shorter, but so I come to conclusions. So similar to circular dichroism in magnetism, where you switch the spin angular momentum of photon and you look at some effects, we have shown that also when you now change values of OEM, you get different types of effects in magnetic scattering that we call magnetic helicoidal dichroism. And I just go through, as I just presented, right? We first developed the classical electromagnetic theory. There's no microscopic interaction here. It's just taken as a magnetization, as a scattering plane for the light. Then we did our first experiment that shows that this could potentially be a new investigation tool, which provides some precise information on the topology, not only on the intensity of the magnetization, which is nice for people in magnetism, and then find out in this particular case of a magnetic vortex of this shape, of this size, of this material, that on a 20 picosecond time scale, there happened to be a transient reversal at the surface, which actually could be also potentially interesting if you want to play with rotating the direction of the vortex and doing some sort of calculations, let's say. Now, perspectives of this, of course, this study is initiated as a fundamental interest, right? Understanding what's happening when you have interaction of light carrying on with angular momentum with material. And as Martin will probably talk about tomorrow, this opens a bit more fundamental question about, for example, photon spin-orbit coupling and whether there is transfer of angular momentum from the light to the material or vice versa. Now, a bit more critically, now, is there something really new about this? Because we just took classical electromagnetism and just plug electric field with OEM and see what happens, right? So nothing really new. And also, I want to point out that maybe the most curious effect that we figure out here is that all of this story also works for beams with L equals 0. If you now come with a standard Gaussian beam on a magnetic sample, it turns out, I think this was kind of overlooked in the literature, it turns out that the outgoing beam carries modes that are not only the initial 1, 0, but also has plus or minus 1 if it's a vortex or others. Maybe it's not so. It's also trivial because, in a sense, it's like scattering from some sort of edge, and then it changes the modes, right? In this case, it's a magnetic edge. But still, it's a fresh point of view, maybe, to look at also studies such as circular dichroism or others, and therefore can open new questions and hopefully new applications. And then, of course, I would like also to go now to other types of techniques, other experiments, namely ptychography, as Giulia Mancini will probably speak about tomorrow. We collaborated in a beam time, still at Fermi. Maurizio presented yesterday other types of application when you move to X-ray range rather than UV, because here I didn't mention it was at the resonance of iron edge at 50 eV, but you can go higher. Or photoemission spectroscopy. This is kind of my dream, since it's my main technique. It would be nice to see what happens when basically light is absorbed by a sample, and now you look at the electronic interaction, not only the photon in, photon out kind of experiment, but really interaction with matter in the sense of electronic interaction. There's many ideas, but still it's a difficult experiment, and theory is lacking, so I think this requires some more work still. So with this, I'm at the end, so thank you for your attention. And